Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Hoda Elhadary, and I would like to welcome our attendees to another one of our webinar series hosted by the Department of English Language and Literature at the British University in Egypt. And today's topic is Rethinking World Literature and Cinema. And we are glad to host Dr. Delia Ungureanu, who has great depth of knowledge and experience in the field of world literature and world cinema. Dr. Delia is the Associate Director of Harvard's Institute for World Literature, and she's also an Associate Professor of Literary Theory in the Department of Literary Studies at the University of Bucharest. She's also the author of From Paris to Tone, if I'm correctly pronouncing it correctly, Surrealism as World Literature, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2017. She is also the author of The Poetics of Apocalypse, the Cultural War in Romanian Literary Magazines from 1944 to 1947. She has published essays on canon formation, modern poetry and poetics, Shakespeare, Nabokov, and she has co-edited with Thomas Bavel Romanian Literature in Today's World, a special issue of the Journal of World Literature. Together with Giselle Sapiro, she has co-edited a special issue of the Journal of World Literature dedicated to the memory and legacy of Pascal Casanova. And with Michael Wood, she has co-edited a special issue of the Journal of World Literature dedicated to the organic relation between literature and cinema. And her most recent publication is Time Regained, World Literature and Cinema, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021, in which she redefines the artistic object beyond disciplinary borders with major filmmakers, including Andrei Tarkovsky, Akira Kurosawa, and Paolo Sorrentino, among others. And by bringing together film with poetry, literature, painting, music, and photography, they create a new type of object that no one discipline can do justice to. And if I may add, it was Michael Wood who described the book as one where there is a new artistic adventure to be found on almost every page. And we have here Professor Damrosch, who himself wrote that Time Regained reveals the hidden common ground between media and fields of study, that have often been seen in separate terms. So not to keep you waiting, I will leave the floor to Dr. Delia to start the talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. And it would be great if you just put your mics on mute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hoda, and thanks everyone for this incredibly warm, in this very wintry day here in Bucharest, this very warm welcome. I hope to rise to the level of the expectations. I do love talking about the connections between literature and the other arts. So this was a wonderful opportunity for me to share my most recent work with our colleagues. So thank you so much, Hoda, for the invitation. So the title of my talk is more specific, is actually Rethinking Circulation in World Literature and Cinema. Now, two rising disciplines of the past decades, world literature and world cinema, have developed in parallel rather than in conjunction, despite sharing a body of theoretical knowledge and also the need to adapt it into a globalized world. Now, their histories differ obviously significantly, as do their objects of study. However, they also overlap and intersect in structural and also meaningful ways. Whereas the concept of world literature was formulated in the era of Herder and Goethe, the concept of world cinema, with the variation world cinemas, dates actually back to 1960s, when it became known as Third World Cinema in Latin America, and it challenged imperialism as opposed to Hollywood and Europe's cinematic hegemony. Similarly, its contemporary manifestations, world literature as a discipline, arose from the canonical battles in the 1990s in the United States of America, sparked by post-colonialists who argued for an ethical and political opening up of the Western canon with its very problematic claims to universality, of which Harold Bloom's Western canon stands a seminal example. The beginning of world cinema as a discipline can actually be traced back to a very important book from 1994, the same year as Harold Bloom's Western canon. It's Ella Shohat and Robert Stamm's Unthinking Eurocentrism, as well as John Hill and Pamela Church Gibson's World Cinema Critical Approaches. Both these books operate with a very clear divide between what they call Hollywood or the first world cinema, the European or the second world cinema, and finally the cinemas of the world which functions in free variation with third world cinema. More often than not, this politicized definition of world cinema or cinemas of the world usually assumes a very stark division between Hollywood, Europe, and the nationally defined cinemas elsewhere in the world. And a prominent example of this is James Chapman's Cinemas of the World from 2003. Even more recent attempts like Paul Cook's Hollywood's Dialogues with World Cinema somehow ends up in perpetuating the very dichotomy it actually seeks to overcome. This division plays out very differently from this discipline of world literature, in which we actually speak of world literature and more increasingly world literatures in the plural, rather than nationally based literatures of the world, and in which the concept of world literature has always included and even privileged, at least up to the mid-1990s, European and American literature. And you have here not only David Amrush's seminal book, the pioneering, the manifesto of the discipline from 2003, What is World Literature, but also the most recent one from 2020, comparing the literatures, where this world literatures in the plural really comes up a lot. World literature and world cinema share more than just a common theoretical basis. Their objects of study are significantly intertwined. Following work done in the field of world literature by Rebecca Wolkowitz, for instance, on the visual Korean artist duo Yonghae Chang Heavy Industries, David Damrosch expands in the recent book Comparing the Literatures, he expands this problem of circulation from circulation between languages to actually circulation between media. And I quote, "Literature has always circulated together with other modes of artistic expression. Painting, sculpture, and music are classic subjects for inter-arts comparison, more recently supplemented by a growing engagement with film studies. But comparatives have done relatively little with the newer media now in play, leaving them to media studies specialists based in national traditions. Classic works have persisted over the centuries precisely through their adaptability to new times and new media." And I put here just one such example of an amazing classic, Dante's Inferno, which takes up such different forms from painting, sculpture to film. And for instance, Michelangelo, Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, the right lower side of the image where he paints the Inferno is literally a visual rendering of Dante's Inferno. Then 5 centuries later, we have Auguste Rodin carving his masterpiece, the magnum opus, The Gates of Hell, using Dante's Inferno and representing himself as Dante, looking back on his work, which is kind of like an inferno. And then more recently in the 20th century, we have two major world filmmakers taking up Dante. On the one hand, it's the theorist and the poet Pier Paolo Pasolini in Salo and 120 Days of Sodom, which takes up again the inferno to structure the narrative of the film in 9 different circles. And more recently in 2021, Andrei Konchalovsky's film Sin looks back at Michelangelo and his very fraught relationship with Dante. Now, from its early days, cinema was defined as worldly in scope and was seen in conjunction with other forms of art. In May 1929, in the 3rd issue of Jean-Georges Oriol's Du Cinéma, which is actually the future Cahiers du Cinéma, where André Bazin would go on to devise his amazing theoretical body, an editor's note announced that the magazine would take up, quote, toutes les formes de l'activité cinématographique dans le monde, as in all forms of filmic activity in the world. And of course, by this, they did not mean only film. In the same view, Robert Desnos, one of the major surrealist poets who contributed very seriously to Oriol's magazine, he actually believes that cinema should have the imagination and the logic of poetry if it is to escape academism. And he actually warns that intellectuals would destroy, to the detriment of poets, a form of human expression and the world if we allow them to. Now, major filmmakers from Andrei Tarkovsky to Akira Kurosawa have restored this link to the world by creating their films in conjunction not only with other films that film studies usually assume, but especially with major world writers such as Marguerite Yourcenar and also André Breton. And just one example is Marguerite Yourcenar's collection of short stories from 1938, Nouvelles Orientales, Oriental Tales, where two of her short stories would actually become major structuring devices indirectly in Andrei Tarkovsky's Nostalgia and in Akira Kurosawa's film Dreams. Andrei Tarkovsky was the son of a major Russian poet, Arseny Tarkovsky, and his father's poetry became a structuring principle for his logic of film editing, next to Marcel Proust's poetic novel, and also Matsuo Basho's Haiku, in which Tarkovsky felt that that was the closest form to what cinema is called to do, namely pure observation in the form of a visual image. Now, Akira Kurosawa himself grew up as an avid reader, and in his autobiography, which is called Something Like an Autobiography, he remembers that as a child, as I walked to and from school, I was reading the entire time. I read Japanese novelists like Iguchi Ichio, she's the first on the left, Kunikida Dopo, second one, Natsumi Soseki, and the Russian Ivan Turgenev. I read classics and contemporary foreign Japanese literature without discrimination. Almost makes us feel jealous, you know. The discipline of world cinema owes its theoretical backbone to a film scholar with literary training, Dudley Andrew from Yale University, who published in 2004 a very important article called The Atlas of World Cinema, where he outlines the scope and methodology of this new discipline. He defines world cinema as an atlas where he says displacement, not coverage, matters most, and he proposes that locality is the focus of the scholar of world cinema. As he says, every local cinema is examined with an eye to its complex ecology. Thanks to globalization, Andrew notes elsewhere, locality can simultaneously reach audiences around the world. And he says the distinction between local and international is thus not about value, but about address. What global adds to all this is simultaneity. We used to discover local films belatedly. Today, however, an art film made in Tajikistan may very well be seen in Japan before it screens at home. Andrew puts forward the term demi-emigration to point to the complex way in which a culture can be itself without turning in on itself. Andrew's work follows in the footsteps of Franco Moretti's Atlas of the European Novel, David Damrosch's defining world literature as that which gains in translation, and also Martin Buchner's emphasis on the revolutionary, exceptional literature that makes a difference in the world. Fascinated with Franco Moretti's metaphor of the wave that Moretti put forth in his very cited essay, Conjectures on World Literature, Dudley Andrew extends the metaphor of the wave to world cinema, arguing that it accounts for a better understanding of the propagation of cinema around the world. And he goes on to cite waves like the French New Wave or the Romanian New Wave in cinema. As he defines world cinema through its nomadic energy and its defamiliarizing effect in terms of audience expectation, Dudley Andrew proposes two concepts to push against mainstream cinema. One is displacement, the second one is called décalage. He loves the French term. This emphasis is rooted in Pascal Casanova's World Republic of Letters, and in her notion of the peripheral exception that rethinks the doxa, or the location of the world's cinema centers. Now, whereas Casanova speaks of the notion of belatedness in relation to a Greenwich meridian of what passes for the cultural center at a given moment in history, Dudley Andrew speaks of jet lag or décalage. He really loves the French terms here. Now, in Remapping World Cinema, which is the first book published in the wake of Dudley Andrews' 2004 article, the editors, Stephanie Dennison and Songhui Lim, write, what is world cinema? Perhaps this is not the right question to ask in the first place, which is a bit puzzling, you know, because this is, after all, the first book that puts forward the new term. And they go on to argue that world cinema is analogous, they say, to world music and world literature, in that both are categories created in the Western world to refer to cultural products and practices that are mainly non-Western. However, this may be true of world music and of world cinema, but it's the very opposite of world literature. So you almost wonder, what books they've read about world literature. This mistaken understanding of world literature as non-Western literature in the beginning is perpetuated by the 2018 Routledge Companion to World Cinema. In the field of world literature, as it was up to the 1990s, world literature meant actually, on the contrary, almost entirely Western literature. Like, under the pressure of post-colonial studies, world literature started to rethink its premises and its assumption and literary texts, simultaneous with the canonical debate and the need to open up the Western canon in the 1990s, made up until then almost entirely of Western masterpieces, a prominent example being obviously Harold Bloom's Western canon. The editors of a series of American anthologies, and one of them is actually here because it's David, began to rethink the notion, both in theory and also in practice, to include more and more works that were not traditionally in the canon, and especially outside Europe. And I'm thinking here of the first one, The World Reader by Mary Ann Cause and Christopher Pendergrast, Davis's Bedford Anthology of World Literature, and David Damrosch's Longman Anthology of World Literature. Now, Ella Shohat and Robert Stam's book propose a polycentric conception in Unthinking Eurocentrism, their focus being on third world cinema as fighting against the domination of first and second world cinema. Now, today, world literature and world cinema have much in common, much more than their practitioners would even allow it. For instance, in the article called Towards a Positive Definition of World Cinema, Luciana Gibb, who is one of the champions of world cinema studies, she proposes a tripartite definition, which I would like to read to you. So this is actually a quotation from Luciana Gibb's article. So the first definition she proposes is world cinema is simply the cinema of the world. It has no center, it's not the other, but it's us. It has no beginning and no end, but is a global process. 2, world cinema is not a discipline, but a method of cutting across film history according to waves of relevant films and movements, thus creating flexible geographies. And finally, 3rd, as a positive, inclusive, democratic concept, world cinema allows all sorts of theoretical approaches, provided that they are not based on the binary perspective. Now, though Naguib does not cite David Damrosch's tripartite definition, given under the heading conclusion of the book, What is World Literature from 2003, this definition mirrors David Damrosch's definition, not just structurally, but also typographically. And yet, David Damrosch's book is not cited. And I really think we should really acknowledge what we owe to each other. Perhaps that would be a very good starting point for us to actually really think of the connections between our objects of study. As they wish to move away from the binary West versus the rest, Dennison and Song propose rethinking the concept of world cinema through notions like hybridity, transculturation, border crossing, transnationalism, and translation, issues that are obviously also at the heart of world literature. Now, in a manner strikingly similar to David Damrosch's definition that proposes world literature not as a set canon, but as a mode of reading, Dennison and Song describe world cinema as a discipline, methodology, and perspective. It's a vital way of challenging disciplinary divides. Now, for their part, literary comparatists very rarely discuss films, and usually when they do, they only limit themselves to adaptations, as in films that openly adapt a work of literature. The thing is, in today's world, in which the new media often garner more attention than novels, plays, and poetry, and also in the academic world we live in, where we actually see shrinking enrollments in literature classes, I think it is really high time for us comparatists to devote more attention attention to narrative and poetic movements that really go beyond the written page that we are so used to and comfortable with. A closer conjunction of comparative and intermedial studies might benefit both world literary, but also world cinema studies. Both world literature and world cinema have almost always defined circulation within their own medium, books and films respectively. David Damrosch defines world literature as that which circulates in translation, but obviously in 2003, he means translation into another language rather than into another medium. And intermedial studies have been much more the exception than the rule in world literature scholarship. Things are, however, gradually moving in both fields, which are now really rethinking the notion of circulation beyond their discipline's medium of choice. Damrosch, for instance, has recently begun to write on the circulation between also media, not just languages. And I actually recommend his chapter in comparing the literatures, where he discusses two video games, one based on Dante's Inferno, and the other one is Grand Theft Ovid. And he actually has very interesting insights there that we may refer to. Here, world literature scholarship actually really lags well behind an important strand in cinema. 3/4 of a century ago, when we were not even thinking of world literature as we do today, the view that cinema intersects with literature, painting, music, sculpture, or architecture was already at the heart of the French theorist of cinema, Andrei Bazin. As Dudley Andrew writes in his foreword to the 2004 edition of Andrei Bazin's What is Cinema, an adaptation, he says, need neither threaten nor dilute the artwork it takes up. A percentage of the audience will rediscover its subtlety and uniqueness after experiencing its betrayal by the film. In more interesting cases, cinema treats artworks like phenomena in nature, photographing plays and novels or paintings as it might animals or social rituals. The hybrids that result from such encounters illuminate hitherto unexplored aspects of the famous original and of both media. Intermedial world cinema studies take up Bazin's notion of mixed or impure cinema, cinéma impur, he says in French. These two notions, together with the concept of adaptation as translation of an artistic idea into a different medium, is actually the subject of a recent collection by Luciana Gibb and Anne Yerslev called Impure Cinema, Intermedial and Intercultural Approaches to Film. There, they propose that they would analyze films and other forms of audiovisuality, which intentionally highlight and rely upon their mixed character in order to convey meaning. Where the relation between literature and film is concerned, the film discussed in intermediate studies, they're actually usually direct adaptations of works of world literature. And when I say direct, it means that the director is openly and directly naming the work of literature that he or she is bringing to screen. However, there are many other films that are highly impure or mixed, whatever you want to call it, and they can actually enter a much more subtle dialogue with literature, with painting, with poetry, even with photography and also architecture. While the author's declared intention is, of course, always a good start, it is really not just it's not the whole story of circulation, but also it's really not very reliable. And here I really side by Umberto Eco, who says that intentio auctoris can never be trusted, especially with great writers or great filmmakers, because if they would do all the work for you, what would you as reader or viewer do? So the history of art and literature actually shows how the most complex objects often obscure or internalize the works that they are in dialogue with or rewrite. Andrei Bazin was a film theorist with a literature degree and a strong background in the history of art. So, there is also hope for all of us here. Who knows, maybe we're going to turn into the next film theorist. His concept of realism was actually indebted to his early interest in the surrealists' notion of surreality as surréalité, which was a way for the surrealists to point at a higher meaning of the world around us through the automatism of what they called objective hazard. Bazin saw the film as a world. For a time, he writes in an article, a film is the universe, the world, or if you like, it is like nature. Writing about Charlie Chaplin, he says that this is truly the only best way of being an artist, not of serving a particular art. Half a century before David Damrosch defines world literature through circulation and translation, Bazin put forth a rather different notion of translation that actually resonates prophetically with Lawrence Venuti's understanding that translation really changes everything in a positive sense. Translation, as André Bazin understood it, was also translation between media. And in this particular case, we're talking about the translation from literature to film. And he says in the article in defense of impure cinema, the filmmakers honestly attempt an integral equivalent. They try at least not simply to use the book as an inspiration, not merely to adapt it, but to translate it onto the screen, as instanced in films like La Symphonie Pastorale, Le Diable au corps, The Fallen Idol, or Le Journal d'un curé de campagne. He also writes then that adaptations, which the modern critic looks upon as a shameful way out, are actually an established feature of the history of art. And just to give you a sense of what this truly transformative translation is all about, I would actually quote two absolutely amazing art films by Akira Kurosawa, both of them. The first one, Throne of Blood from 1957, is an amazing transformation of Shakespeare's Macbeth into the reality of medieval Japan with the cultural values of medieval Japan. So you no longer really have Macbeth. Everything changes, including the names of the characters and even the turn of the plot. And the same goes for Kurosawa's The Idiot from 1951, which takes Dostoevsky's 19th century exile novel and he brings it into contemporary Japan in the aftermath of Hiroshima. So it's absolutely an amazing new understanding of a plot that becomes something radically different. Characters change, the reality changes. So that's the kind of transformative effect that I'm interested in. This exchange of ideas is absolutely always mutual. In 1920, the language of film sparked André Breton, who is the father of surrealism, sparked his interest in a new form of automatic poetry, which he described in a letter to his back then future wife, Simone Kahn. So this is 1921 when we still have intertitles because the film would be silent film. So he says, yesterday, I had a strange idea for writing poetry by copying a film's intertitles. This makes language incredibly picturesque. In 1952, André Bazin describes the reverse process. As he says, the making of films that dare to take their inspiration from a novel style, one might describe as ultra-cinematographic. And Akira Kurosawa would agree, in order to write scripts, you must first study the great novels and dramas of the world. Now, to better understand André Bazin's circulation as translation and adaptation for the mutual benefit of, in our case, literature and cinema, I will discuss three examples that all pose theoretical problems at the heart of disciplines that work on a world scale. And these issues are problems of circulation beyond medium, multilingualism, locality, ethnicity, exile, and belonging. Bazin writes that montage, or the ordering of images in time, is the pure language of cinema. But we may ask ourselves, well, isn't literature doing exactly the same thing? You know, the German philosopher Lessing would certainly think so. And yet modernist writers like Proust and Woolf rejected the new medium of film as unable to construct an emotional arc to escape, Proust said, time's irreversibility. This is definitely true of cinema's early days, which is the 1920s, when Woolf and Proust addressed the new medium. However, contemporary filmmakers like the Chilean Raúl Ruiz in Time Regained, and also the film director Stephen Daldry, he's actually he's a theater director with a literature degree in The Hours. They both read Proust and Woolf respectively as writers who actually have a cinematic imagination. And they go on to show this amazing thing about their works in a revolutionary type of film that shows us things that we, scholars of literature, could not see with our own instruments. And we actually had to go to the film people to understand this. Now, Proust criticized the art of film in 1920 because it cannot, he says, render our inner reality. Nothing is further from what we have really perceived than the visions that the cinematograph presents. He suggests then that the true way to render this reality, he says, Proust, is by juxtaposing images and sensations to defeat time's irreversibility and to construct metaphors hors du temps, outside time. And Proust writes in À la recherche du temps perdu, the final volume, Le Temps Retrouvé, a connection that is suppressed in a symbol cinematographic vision, which thus, because it professes to confine itself to the truth, in fact, departs wildly from it, a unique connection, which the writer has to rediscover in order to link forever, in his phrase, the two sets of phenomena, which really joins together. Truth will be attained by him only when he takes two different objects, states the connection between them. Truth and life too can be attained by us only when, by comparing a quality common to the two sensations, we succeed in extracting their common essence and in reuniting them with each other, liberated from the contingencies of time within a metaphor. However, this is something that film editing, montage, and special effects can do. They could not do it in Proust's days. So actually, the history of cinema kind of contradicts Proust, and hence it allows for Raúl Ruiz to show us that Proust did really have a cinematic imagination. This cinematic imagination had actually been revealed retrospectively by filmmakers who read Proust and use his ideas to define their own poetics of cinema. Among them stand major filmmakers from Andrei Tarkovsky to the Japanese Akira Kurosawa, Ingmar Bergman, and Raúl Ruiz, who is a Chilean director. Ruiz, in particular, believes that our subconscious actually operates in a mode of photographic montage. But in our lives, he writes, these possible montages are uncontrollable because they are necessarily different for every spectator. They form a type of photographic unconscious already mentioned here, which we could call potential montage. Everyone, he says, associates bits of memory so that incidents which did not actually happen in succession are juxtaposed in our memory. We all possess a huge number of potential film sequences that coexist in a compact space and time. These sequences are interchangeable and superimposed one on the other. All these films are sleeping within us. And these are two stills from Raúl Ruiz's Le Temps Retrouvé, the film about Proust's entire book, where we see little Marcel playing with a magic lantern, which he uses both as a projection camera, but also as a filming camera as he is filming us. And as he does that, he also plays, just like the narrator of Proust, he plays in the darkness of his room before he goes to bed with the magic lantern. The upper still shows little Marcel projecting a story, the story of Geneviève de Brabant, a medieval story, onto a character who is part of his contemporary world, and that is Gilberte. And this is how we have two opposite objects coming from two very different temporal layers that are superimposed in the film of memory. This is exactly what Proust was describing earlier, that literature can do and cinema does. Well, you know, Raúl Ruiz shows us differently. This is also the poetics of Raúl Ruiz's Time Regained from 1999. And his reading of Proust's novel as a proto-surrealist in terms of defining reality and the object as both oriented towards the past, but also, more importantly, toward the future, becoming prophetic of the future. Raul Ruiz's film is structured as the dying author's juxtaposed memories as he looks one more time at photographs showing people he knew, usually people who are dead now. He looks at them through a magnifying glass. And as he does that, he slowly falls into a dream vision in which he sees his unfinished book knitted together through the free association of ideas of someone on the brink of death. Proust believed that memory is a sculpture of genius that carves in time and extracts from the abandoned quarry our self is innumerable different statues. As he was following, actually, the French poet Victor Hugo with his Temps, ce grand sculpteur, time, this great sculpture, Proust was also opening the way for a major contemporary filmmaker, Andrei Tarkovsky, whose theory of cinema is called Sculpting in Time, and he takes his cue from Proust. And Tarkovsky writes, what is the essence of the director's work? We could define it as sculpting in time. Proust also spoke of raising a vast edifice of memories, and that seems to me to be what cinema is called to do. It could be said to be the ideal manifestation of the Japanese concept of sabi, for as it masters this completely new material, time, it becomes, in its fullest sense, a new muse. After Andrei Tarkovsky, Raul Ruiz's understanding of cinema as a shamanic activity is inspired by Proust itself, as it takes us to, Ruiz writes, a region inhabited by the ghosts of lost time. And this takes us to our second case study, Memory, a Film Camera. Like Proust, Woolf herself believed that the alliance between film and literature is unnatural, she writes. However, in the same essay from 1925 called On Cinema, Woolf also expresses her interest in what it could become in the future if filmmakers were to pay more attention to the passage of time and the suggestiveness of reality. However, reality is much more than suggestive. It can really do much better. It actually is prophetic. Norman Mana's exile memoir, The Hooligan's Return from 2003, tells the story of his return to his country, Romania, a country he left in 1986 after a traumatic past that began with his deportation to Transnistria in 1941 during the Holocaust. A Jewish writer forced into an eternal exile, first by the Nazis and later by the communists, Mana tells a very difficult life story, apparently in the form of a memoir, which weaves its complex moral meaning at the intersection of literature, film, poetry, painting, and architecture. And he writes here, quoting himself, Proust, "The only comfort as I went to bed was that my mother would come and kiss me goodnight," as Proust wrote, is alien to my life story. For her son, the perpetually hungry, ghostly creature, the supreme evocation was not Proust's Madeleine dipped in tea, but onion pie, a miracle as unknown to the Parisian Marcel as was hunger. Tea, for me, as for many other East European youngsters, was the hot drink offered by the Red Cross upon our return from the labor camp. The story is made up of different temporal layers that intersect through a montage logic that illustrates almost word by word Raul Ruiz's point about the cinematic quality of human memory. So it's not surprising then that Norman Mana turns to a major world filmmaker with poetic imagination to construct his narrative, punctuated by a dream logic, the Russian Andrei Tarkovsky and his film Ivan's Childhood, which Norman Mana uses to describe, he writes, a time of solar blankness without contours or memories, an idyllic time, one of which the mind picks up only a flash of a sloping street and the entrance to my grandfather's bookstall. Memory does not say much about the way I was before the true birth, which was still to come, much later. Fiction was perhaps more eloquent. A scene from Andrei Tarkovsky's Ivan's Childhood, which I watched endlessly. Many years later, the blonde child, the laughing mother, happiness. Suddenly, the arm of the water well swinging madly. The mirror of the lake shattered by the thundering explosion. War. Ivan is a 12-year-old boy who witnesses his mother being killed by the Nazis during the war. Therefore, he enrolls in the Red Army as a spy to avenge his mother's death. Andrei Tarkovsky tells the story on two temporal layers: the idyllic past when his mother was alive, a time he encounters only in dreams, and the apocalyptic present of war. The story is constructed around 5 different dreams that Ivan has, the most important one being the third. Sorry, I think somehow it stopped, which is strange. Okay, I'll play it again. Sorry about this. Technical glitches.
Глубоко, а? Конечно. Если колодец очень глубокий, то даже в самый солнечный день в нем можно увидеть звезду. Какую звезду? Да любую. Вижу, мам, вижу. Да-да, вон она. А почему она? Потому что для нее сейчас ночь. Вот она и вышла как ночь. А разве сейчас ночь? Сейчас день. Для тебя день, для меня день, а для нее ночь.
Ivan is asleep in a dark room, and only the sound of water dripping is heard. Next to Ivan's bed, the camera looks up to see where the water is coming from. But instead of the ceiling, we see the other end of a water well's pit. Ivan is sleeping at the bottom of the pit and dreams of what is above, himself and his mother, against a clear sky one summer day. They are looking into the well's water and into the camera, or at Ivan's sleeping in the future and dreaming of his past. Ivan's mother shares with him a secret. In a very deep well, you can see a star even on the brightest day. It came out just like it was night. But isn't it daytime? Asks the confused Ivan. Well, it's daytime for you and me, but it's really nighttime for the star, explains his mother. As they both look into the camera's eye, Ivan stretches out as if to catch the star hidden in the waters of time, and we see him now at the bottom of the well in total darkness trying to catch a glimmering light. He looks up again to see his mother at the top of the pit as if trying to warn him of something, but no word is heard, only the bucket falls with a thud. Tarkovsky then cuts to the surface, where Ivan's mother is lying on the ground next to the well, and the water in the bucket splashes her with the sound of an explosion that wakes our dreamer and also us. Through a brilliant montage, Tarkovsky explores the function of the dreamer's memory while pointing at a darker moral truth, that the past, present, and future, all of them exist simultaneously, separated only by a corridor one can access only in dreams, and that is the well's pit or the camera's eye. They show us that the star Ivan's mother speaks of is actually her own son in the future that follows also his being hanged by the Nazis at the end of the film. So little Ivan shines in death as the bright star of his mother's eyes. Andrei was actually right to speak of writers influenced by filmmakers, a dimension inherent in our contemporary world literature. While critics are apt to view with regret sometimes the borrowings made by cinema from literature, the existence of a reverse process is as accepted as it is undeniable. The chapter Night Train in Norman Mana's memoir is a poem in prose. It's also a psalm of lament that engages with the psalms of lament in the Bible, structured by the amazing Death Fugue, the Holocaust poem written by Paul Celan, and also Marc Chagall's painting, The Martyr from 1940, turned real by the Holocaust and Mana's own story of deportation. This actually means that Raoul Ruiz was indeed right. Our memory does function like a film camera, juxtaposing vignettes through our inner logic of traumatic experiences that defies chronology and sees a deeper pattern of time hidden underneath. The banal train that takes Norman Mana in the present back to Suceava to visit his mother's tomb is superimposed in a nightmare on the death train that deported him and his family to Transnistria, which is actually rewritten by Mana as Transtristia in a dialogue with Ovid's poetry, who is exiled by the Emperor Augustus in what he calls really the edge of the world, Pontus Euxinus, which is actually Romania today. So we're very proud that he was there. And there Ovid wrote his exilic poetry called Tristia, which means actually the country of sorrow. It's the country of sadness. And he opens Tristia with these two verses. Parvene in video sine me liber ibis in urbem et mihi quod domino non licet ire tuo. Little book, you will go without me, and I grudge it not to the city. Alas, that your master is not allowed to go. Similarly, Norman Mana's book is the hooligan's return to his Tristia, or his past, which basically is Romania, or the country of sorrow and the country of sadness. And it's the same motherland that he lives in 1986, never to see again. Just like in Paul Celan's Death Fugue, the chapter Night Train in Norman Mana's memoir is structured by recurring themes and metaphors. However, the most haunting metaphor, visually and auditorily, is the image of the sound of the train wheels madly turning. These are heard in 3 different instances, each time with a difference, and they actually mark 3 layers of time. First, it's 1941, and it's the train deportation to Transnistria. Second is 1945, which is the train that takes him back to Tristia, the train that marks, as he writes, the miraculous return. And finally, in 1997, when he returns to his country, Romania, for the first time after the fall of communism. Like in the nightmare scene, where Ivan dreams of his idyllic past, without knowing that he was actually seeing his future self in the bright star his mother was telling him about, the rough cut between temporal layers juxtaposes past, present, and future, or in Mana's case, the 3 train trips. The wheel's mad rhythm punctuates the different temporal layers and constructs, through the logic of the memory's montage, a death fugue heard in a dream vision. With a cinematic imagination that narrates this vision in the present through sentences modeled on the dream vignettes that are more visual than verbal, Norman Manea brings together Paul Celan's recurrent construction of death fugue, which actually in Romanian, which is the second language that Celan uses to write early surrealist poetry. He actually began by writing surrealist poetry in prose in Romanian. In Romanian, the word would be for death fugue would be fuga morții, which is literally a death run, because in Romanian, the word fugă is both fugue, the musical composition, but also the act of running away. Using actually Andrei Tarkovsky's dream logic to show how the future is always prophesied by the past. Norman Manea further relates his vision to a painting, Marc Chagall's The Martyr, to point at a higher moral truth. And he writes, the ghetto is burning, a pogrom is underway. The scene is a kind of crucifixion, but the horizontal bar of the cross is missing. There's but a single stake to which the martyr is bound, his hands tied behind his back. Death on the cross has transmuted into a burning at the stake, simple and crude. I desperately want to tell him that there's no crucifixion, there's no resurrection, just an ordinary pyre. But the flames are getting closer and closer. I hear the train approaching. I fall asleep again, and then I wake up with a sudden thought, the postcard of the Chagall painting. But there is, however, something in Chagall's painting that exists only silently in Norman Manea's vision. The upper side of the martyr reveals the space in which the scene takes place. This is no shtetl as you would expect, but a train car whose roof top is missing, revealing a thin azure line of the sky. It's almost like it tells us that one only has to raise one's eyes to see that there is a cloudless sky, though it takes the experience of death to see it. Ivan himself has to die in order to become the bright star his mother sees in the waters of the well. A similar effect is played out in architect Daniel Libeskind's construction of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, structured along three architectural axes, the axis of continuity, the axis of the Holocaust, and the axis of exile. The axis of exile takes you out in what is called the Garden of Exile, made of 49 concrete blocks that allow only one person at a time to pass through, creating thus a prison-like effect that makes you really raise your eyes to the sky because you really feel the need to breathe. And as you look up, you see that olive trees grow on these concrete walls, lighting up the sky. This is an architectural correspondent to Paul Celan's recurring metaphor in Death Fugue. We dig up a grave in the sky where it's roomy to lie. In turn, Paul Celan is rewriting again Ovid's poetry, but this time it's not the exilic poetry, but it's rather a fragment from Ars Amatoria, which is a book published by Ovid 26 years before his exile to Pontus Euxinus. And in Ars Amatoria, he goes on to write about the visionary architect Daedalus, who is imprisoned in his own labyrinth by King Minos of Crete. And there he discovers that the only way out is by flying. No escape by sea or land. All that remains is the sky. So through the sky we'll seek our passage. God in high heaven, forgive such a project. I do not aspire to touch your starry dwellings. This is the only way I have to escape, my master. Were there a way by Styx, through Stygian waters, we would swim to freedom. I must devise new laws for human nature. From Daedalus's wings to the Nazi crematories lies a world history of exile, imprisonment, and trauma that paradoxically allows for the discovery of revolutionary ideas that can also change our world for the better. Or as Viktor Frankl would write, another Auschwitz survivor in Man's Search for Meaning. Therefore, The Hooligan's Return is really no mere memoir that may read sometimes like a novel. It's rather a visionary construction that demonstrates how we can no longer truly separate literature from film, from poetry, from architecture, even from the biblical text, because another intertext here in the metaphor of the wheels madly turning is also the vision of Ezekiel, the vision of God's chariot of fire, which is made of God's eyes, which is really like an apocalyptic vision. Therefore, literally and in every other way, Norman Mânea shows us that the sky truly is the limit. And we, scholars of literature and cinema, art history, should actually simply follow his example and expand our theories to match the complexity of such objects of study. And finally, just very briefly, for the last 10 minutes, I will look at another important question, locality, and that is my third and last case study. This one is very brief. The editors of Theorizing World Cinema rely on Luciana Gibbs' notion of world cinema as world cinema's mutual relation and interconnectedness. They are the national, the transnational, the diasporic, and the realistic projects. Whereas in its earlier phases, transnationalism in film studies was synonym with homogenizing globalization, the editors of Theorizing World Cinema proposed to rethink transnationalism through the radical potential of world cinema, including the questioning of imposed ideas of national cinemas. Writing of the emergence of a Romanian new wave in the year 2000 through widely acclaimed and award films like Cristi Puiu and also Cristian Mungiu, Galt and Schonover conclude that this raises an interest, they say, in Romanian culture or film history that did not exist before. However, whereas Puiu and Mungiu are Romanian directors who continue to make films mostly about Romanian realities, we could also think of more ambiguous cases that really push us to rethink imposed ideas of national cinema to better understand how circulation of people, but also of ideas across media, questions locality, ethnicity, race, even religion. In 2005, Radu Mihailanu, a Romanian Jewish poet and filmmaker who fled from communist Romania to Israel in 1980, and who is now a French citizen, he created a film which is called Live and Become, Va, Vie et Deviant. This is a film, is truly a prime example, I think, of world literature, which he also then turns into a novel. But also his earlier films like Temps de Vie, but also his later Le Concert, all of them dramatize the complexities of national, political, religious, and racial belonging through narratives that are both worldly in scope, but also very local. And they all mirror the director's own complex sense of identity, which he describes in an interview. I realize, he says, that there are recurrent themes in my films that really keep coming back. They rise from the unconscious, from what I lived, immigration, the problem of identity, because I always ask myself, what am I? Romanian, Jew, Frenchman, citizen of the world. In my films, characters of different identities interact, at first poorly, of course, because they think so differently. But what I'm interested in is really how they manage to become closer and to get along. Va Vie Deviant tells the story of a Christian Ethiopian boy whose mother passes him as a Jew to save him from starvation in 1984 during the Operation Moses that rescued Ethiopian Jews from Sudan. The film opens in the refugee camp where a Jewish Ethiopian named Hannah, she loses her son, who's called Shlomo. Later that evening, when Hannah is supposed to leave for Israel, her Christian friend Kidane silently asks her to take her own son and pass him off as her son Shlomo. Then in Israel, Hannah dies, so poor Shlomo remains for a second time without a mother, and he is adopted by a family of leftist secular Jews who raise Shlomo and support him through school to become a doctor. Growing up, Shlomo dreams of one thing, how to be reunited with his mother. After many trials that expose Shlomo to racial and religious intolerance, but also to many proofs of affection and compassion that cross all forms of borders, he returns to the refugee camp, now a doctor and a married man, himself just becoming a father, only to find his mother in the same spot at the refugee camp, silently waiting for his return. Radu Mihailanu published a volume of poetry in French in 1987 called Une vague en mal de mer, which would translate a seasick wave. And he actually remained a poet in everything he did afterwards, including his films. If we look at this film, Va vie deviant, through the logic of the metaphors from his book of poetry, both visually and linguistically, we are really handsomely rewarded. Mihailanu uses two metaphors as structuring principles for his circular narrative of crossing linguistic, religious, ethnic, and also national borders. It's the metaphor of the hands that touch, and also the metaphor of the moon that accompanies Shlomo in his new world. A series of handshakes trace Shlomo's circular journey from Sudan to Israel to France, and then back to Sudan. Individually, these handshakes connect the characters across boundaries of race, religion, languages. Collectively, over the course of the film, they actually connect the principal characters across times and places. The second metaphor that structures Mihailanu's film is the moon. Little Shlomo watches the moon every night, seeing there both his mother's face, but also the face of God. With its feminine and temporal meaning, the moon is also an epitome of the metaphor of hands holding as it reunites mother and son across time and space. In Romanian, the metaphor of the moon is called metafora lunii, which is almost a perfect homophone for metafora lumii, which is metaphor of the world. So this hidden linguistic meaning becomes visible in the opening and closing images of the film, as well as at its very core. The film opens and closes with a zooming in and zooming out of the refugee camp. And as we look at it from above and at a distance, it looks like a map that is echoed in the film in a close-up of the Wailing Wall, where little Shlomo is taken there by his adoptive father.
Je vais vous donner un papier, vous écrivez votre vœu dessus. Tiens, je vais vous donner un stylo. Vous écrivez le vœu, vous veillez à ce que personne ne regarde dessus. Vous en parlez à personne, vous le mettez là et le vœu sera exaucé.
Pourquoi les attentes de vœux, les gens ne sont pas heureux à Jérusalem?
Je sais ce que Shlomo a écrit. Il a écrit « J'aimerais te revoir, maman. »
Writing his secret wish to see his mother on a piece of paper, little Shlomo sticks it between the stones of the wall next to so many others. And as he asks his father why all these wishes, are people unhappy in Jerusalem, the camera follows his eyes in a close-up of the wall. The countless wishes form a path, an improbable journey to a place where all wishes are granted. Through the cinematography, Mihailanu configures a metaphor at a distance. The tents of the refugee camp really look from above like so many pieces of paper that carry wounds and secret wishes as they wander through the desert. The novel Va vie deviant closes with Shlomo hearing the pain of humanity throughout history in his mother's cry when he reunites with her in the refugee camp. Then a wheeze escapes, augments and mounts, a cry of revolt and happiness, a terrible cry from the depths of history, a cry silenced in her loins for 17 years. Finally, Kidana lets this cry out, this cry that took her son's place one day. From above and under the moonlight, the refugee camp and the wall look really like the surface of the moon, populated by the white dust on the endless grains of sand of humanity. Shlomo's story is not just a very local and very isolated story. It's actually the story of mankind, as similar and as diverse as the moon dust or the infinite grains of sand in the refugee camp our world is. This perspective takes us back to a poem from Mihailyanu's 1987 volume of poetry, and it's called The Grain of Sand. Quelque part, en plein milieu du Sahara, un grain de sable se disait « À mon âge, et j'ai vu le temps passer, je me rends compte que dans ce monde, depuis toujours, à tout jamais, les grains de sable sont condamnés à vivre seuls. » À peine sa phrase fut terminée, un vent de l'Est vint l'emporter et le vieux grain bien grassouillé se retrouva philosopher dans un verre d'eau, which in English would be somewhere in the middle of the Sahara, a grain of sand, was musing. At my age, and I've really lived some, I realized that in this world, forever and ever, the grains of sand are doomed to live alone. With its sentence barely finished, an eastern winter blew away, and the old thick grain found itself philosophizing in a grass of water. I believe that just like this grain of sand, our objects of study and also our disciplines, be they world literature, cinema, or whatever it is we're working on, are truly much more connected than we think. All we need to do is actually just learn how to look better. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delia. I can't thank you enough for such an interesting talk. We have people already raising their hands. So if anyone has a question, would you please just drop it in the chat box? I can see that Professor Fatin has left a comment. Professor Fatin, would you like to say it? Or would you like me to read it for you?
Sorry, Hoda, yeah, you could read it if you think it's better. Yeah, please.
Professor Fatin is saying, thanks for a very interesting presentation, Delia. I suggest you look into the very interesting new wave of Iranian cinema, a wealth of movies that could be compared to other world cinema as well. I'm not sure whether you've done anything on Iranian cinema. And
no, I haven't.
You haven't. Okay. So here's a suggestion. And she says there is notably Italian neoliberalism and Arab/North African movies directed by women. Also, your presentation hardly mentions resistance cinema, a resistance literature from the Battle of Algeria, a world classic revolutionary movie, to other African movies from all over the continent. And she's saying thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Definitely. I know it's one of my great projects to actually expand this, and I have not yet gotten to this part of Iranian cinema, so thank you very much for that. No, but I think this whole problem of locality is really very, very interesting, because that's actually one of the points I was making, that I really think that this national framing that world cinema is trying to promote sometimes really ends up in pigeonholing, like, for instance, if you look at the Routledge Companion to World Cinema from 2018, you really see it structured, as they actually say, on parallels and meridians, so that they would really cover the whole globe. But I actually think it's not, the point is not the coverage, just like Dudley Andrews says, but rather how a particular film pushes against something or adds something to the conversation. And, like, localities is very complex, like, just the case of Mihailanu. What are his films? Are they Romanian films? Are they the films of a French guy who was just born in Romania, even though his Romanian is really writing behind his French poetry? So I think the question of locality is much more complex, much more than world cinema studies is, I think, right now looking at.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else has questions, or should I bump with my question? Okay. So,
yes, I have a question, please, Dr. Hoda.
Please go ahead.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Delia. I'm Nagwa. We've been exchanging emails. Delia. Okay, Delia. I just, first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for such an informative webinar. It was very, very interesting. And I just want to, you kindly to elaborate. You mentioned about Proust, you were talking about in cinema of the vision and reality. And in one of the slides you talked about two sensations, So I didn't actually get exactly what you mean by two sensations with regards to when exposing reality and vision in a movie.
Oh, thank you. Definitely. Actually, I was not saying it. Proust was. So let me just briefly.
If we go back to
yes, let's just get back to that. Thank you so much for raising the question. God, I have so many slides. I mean, I actually had 84 slides, so it's
the one about at the end. You mentioned two sensations. You were talking about vision, and it doesn't expose the reality in the movie.
So yeah, this is the quote where he speaks about this, right? So he says, a connection that is suppressed in a simple cinematographic vision. And by that, he basically means just your typical cinematograph that just records reality as is, does not make changes because you don't really have the complex editing of montage, to do it. And that's why he says, it only captures the irreversibility of time, but it doesn't do much with it. Whereas Proust says, well, sometimes a moment in the past just appears in the middle of the present. So how do you show that if that's all the cinema can do? So then he says, a connection that is suppressed. Yes. And he says, truth, light, and life too can be attained by us only when, by comparing a quality common to two sensations, we succeed in extracting their common essence and in reuniting them with each other, liberated from the contingencies of time within a metaphor. So I actually have an example for this. It was also the example that I showed you from Reis's film, where he is projecting the story of Geneviève de Brabant through a slide on the face of a contemporary character. Now, in the book, this is to be seen when, for instance, Proust has recurrent patterns of relationships. His relationship with Gilberte is another version of his future relationship with Albertine, which is only another instance of Swann's relationship with Odette. And these are really three very different temporal layers. And one thing that Proust does is to show that recurrent moments in time actually express themselves similarly, because behind them there is one single idea. So namely, behind Odette, Gilberte, Albertine, who are three different women living in three different times, having relationships with different men, there is but one idea, which is an embodiment of the woman whom they all call goddess, and they embody her in different forms, in different ways. So this is what Proust means when he says, comparing a quality common to two sensations. So on the one hand is the sensation that Swann has when he sees Odette, because he first sees her performing Venteuil's sonata, which Swann was really obsessed with. He immediately superimposes her with the pleasant sensation the sonata gives him, and all of a sudden she embodies what that sensation is. So for him to capture it is actually to hold it in his possession, to have a form of the beyond. Actually, there's a very beautiful quote from the story of Swann and Odette, which kind of comes up at the end of their love story, where Swann muses at another soirée where he hears again Venteuil's sonata, but right now Odette no longer loves him. Swann remembers how much she loved him, and she sees in front of him that someone whom she loved. So in the same present, you have him in the present and him from, a few years before. And it's the same sensation, and it's the same sensation that also the narrator will experience when he, for instance, sees for the first time Gilberte, because he associates Gilberte with hawthorn flowers, which were for him a form of happiness in Combray. So actually, Swann and the narrator, they look for the same thing, a form of getting outside the time, the hors du temps that Proust says any metaphor is called to do. So in different temporal layers, they actually seek the same thing. And therefore, by creating this parallelism, they become one and the same object. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank
I'm going to close this.
Okay, so do you have any other questions? Actually, I have one of my own. I have a question to ask you, Delia. I've been reading a bit about world cinema, and there was Stephen Croft's systematic breakdown of national cinemas. I'm not sure whether you've seen this one. And yeah, and now we're talking about world cinema. Can you see that both of them converge in a way? Like he has broken them down. So do you think there is a possibility of convergence here?
A convergence between the national and the world, you mean?
Yes, especially with something like Iranian cinema coming to the forefront of festivals, being successful among people who have never heard about Iran, or maybe don't know the language or anything.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that was the whole point. I mean, because like with the case of Mihailano, it's really exactly what you see. Something that you would normally judge, oh, this is French cinema because, right, it's in French, and that's the end of that. But actually, when you look behind at the trajectory of the director, the story he tells you, and you look back at, well, he started as a poet, and by the way, he started as a poet in Romania, and he was writing poetry into Romanian. Then he switched to writing into French. I think this is where Herta Müller has a very interesting point to make, which would explain how do we bring the national and the world together. So back in 2009, when Herta Müller received the Nobel Prize for Literature, she was asked, so how do you define your literature? Is it German? Is it Romanian? Because she is born in Romania. She lives there until 1987 when she emigrates to Germany. She continues to write about Romanian realities, but she writes in German. Now, in the first day when the Nobel was announced, the Romanian newspapers, very happily said, yes, Nobel Prize for Romania. And everybody was, very surprised. And the next day, a milder version of this appeared, which said, the Romanian-born German writer Herta Müller won the Nobel Prize for Literature. In the Nobel interview, she was asked about her relationship with language, because it's German. And she said, well, the thing is like this. My German that I learned speaking it as a minority in Romania, where Romanian is, main language, is a different kind of German than the German spoken in Germany, obviously. But also, she said, my German is more special because it writes with Romanian always in the back. And she says that I learned Romanian when I was 15, and I immediately loved its new take on reality, because she says more languages mean actually more different views of reality. So she says it's not really German literature, it's not really Romanian literature, it's something in between, because her German is reshaped by her sensual experience, she says, of the metaphors in Romanian. So I think it's kind of the same thing here as well. Definitely the national cannot be dropped. And I think this is a point that David Demrush has made very clearly in comparing the literatures. Maybe actually David can say something to this. The national cannot be dropped, but however, the national becomes much more complicated, I think, than it used to be until the 1990s. David, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it's very nice you point up Delia Andrews emphasizing the localization, and increasingly, I think these two things go deeply together, including the multiplicity of a national belonging, as with Müller or the Mihailanu, that amazing film. He's really a French filmmaker, and really he's Romanian, and he's really Israeli. All of the three together. It seems to me that this is also pulling. You might say, would it be to say that because cinema is so contemporary and so recent, relatively speaking, it's doing a geographical layering that can be compared to the temporal layering that's in terms of literary history. And of course, there's temporal layers, as Delia has been showing within these films. but against the deeper background of an older literary history. I thought it was really interesting with the mention of the Ovid with Tristia and Transtristria, and in particular in relation to Chelan, because also in that death fugue, he's talking about dein goldenes Haar Margareta and dein aschenes Haar Shulamit.
Your ashen hair Shulamit, yes.
Right. So it's a golden hair of Margareta. So the Shulamit maiden, of course, Song of Songs. The golden hair of Margareta is the betrayed heroine of Goethe's Faust. So you have these layers of literary history, also of language there, and that then the filmmakers can layer also geographically.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I have another one, if you don't mind.
I do not. I would love to answer if I
can. It was a question one of my students asked me today. She said she won't be able to attend, and she wanted me to ask you the question. So she wrote the question actually, and she said that several authors who have claimed using global systemic approaches to literature have also sketched similar approaches to film. However, these contributions are sometimes not as systemic as their title suggests, and on other occasions, they have not been developed beyond hints. So where do you see the future of this interdisciplinarity between world literature and world cinema, if there could be something like this?
Like beyond the world scale?
Yeah,
if I understand.
She says, like, sometimes this is what I understood from her. She said, like, sometimes authors would assume that they are doing or they are writing or taking an approach of a world literature or world cinema, but actually they are just not delving deep into it. It's kind of a superficial analysis or hints to this, but not actually deep into this. Do you think there is a possibility, according to her, for a deeper analysis between these interdisciplinaries?
Well, you'll always have people who just do bad work, both as scholars and both as, writers. I mean, seriously, because we actually know, I think, David, who was it that said, how many Renaissance poets were there and how many do we actually teach? I mean, that's pretty much what history retains. And I think more recently, Franco Moretti made the point about the 19th century novel, right? Where he said, I mean, man, we are not reading not even 0.01% of the entire production of novels, which tells you something about, what actually remains in time. Of course,
it's what he calls the slaughterhouse of literature, right?
Yeah. I think it definitely shows something very real. I mean, we know that there are things born for consumption or born, to serve a very specific purpose at a given time. And I think literature and film, many of them, yes, do that. And they're very connected. Some can be more connected to a certain, historical or political problem, and others not. For instance, just one example, I was recently sitting in a very good dissertation committee, wonderful dissertation, actually one of our IWL alumni, Snezhana Ung from University of Timișoara in Romania, and she was writing about Yugoslav novels. And my question, as also the question of the committee was, because she was writing about it as world literature. And we were wondering, well, in 50 years from now, say, or 30 years, would this still be read, this kind of literature that takes up, a very clearly defined historical moment in time, also politically. And of course, you never know, just because some moments remain and others don't. But yes, I do agree that today, words like world and global, they are very much buzzwords for many. That's very true. And yes, sometimes, film directors or writers would try to carve whatever is they're doing so that they would fit this Procrustes bed so that they would sell it or get attention. We know all that. I think our task is to choose wisely. I mean, like, for instance, I never use as case studies things I don't believe in. I mean, things I really like, things I really love, things I thought through a lot. And also, I would say things that, in a way, preoccupy me at a moment in time, as in things that really transcend our daily, boring realities, things that could really become also moral truths, I think. So yeah, there is definitely a future, I think, as long as the work is done in full honesty and not just, to serve a certain program requirement or to get your work published, if that answers the question.
Thank you. I have the answer recorded. I'm going to show it to her. So thank you so much. So I'm not sure whether we have other questions, but I have a question in the private chat. Someone is asking that you've been talking about writers, painters, and specifically the writers, and they are saying, how can all these be investigated within a single intellectual framework, especially with the difficulty to reconstruct original authorial intentions?
Well, I think that's the problem is in the question. Who said we're trying to reconstruct the authorial intention? I was actually just telling you I don't trust it. I don't believe that authorial intention should be the scope of our work. I mean, I think it ceased to be since, the first decades of the 20th century in literary studies. And I do know it still continues to be so. In some literature departments that kind of, lag behind and they're kind of a bit passé. But I really don't think that authorial intention should really be the main thing. That's the whole point. The point of circulation is, here's an idea. It has an afterlife, like Walter Benjamin says in The Task of the Translator. There's an afterlife of the book when it travels in translation. There's an afterlife of the idea when it travels into a different medium and it becomes something else. Like, the example I showed with Dante, for instance. Yes, it becomes something radically different in the field of sculpture with Hoda. Now, how do you approach that? Well, you pick up a very good art historian who specializes in Rodin. You go to the specialist. That's something I think that also David speaks at length in comparing the literatures. It's always this common negotiation between what the specialist can teach you as a comparatist and what you can teach the specialist, because the specialist would of course know things of Rodin that I would never know, things about technique, things about the history of sculpture and how he is, returning to a certain age of the Greek and Roman antiquity in terms of sculpture. And I can learn all that from the specialist. At the same time, I can also use that knowledge to compare it with the knowledge of another specialist, for instance, say, in painting, and I go to a specialist, an art historian who specializes in Michelangelo's painting, and then I learn from him or her how Dante is structuring, to what extent and to what end, Michelangelo's art of painting. And then I can compare the two, and then I can also bring my own knowledge because I'm also a Dante scholar, for instance. So I guess that would be the key. Always go to the specialist, always go to the archive, and then step aside and compare the two, or the more, 3, 4.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else has any questions? I can't see any questions in the chat, Delia. Is there anyone who'd like to comment on anything? Not necessarily a question if you want to. We have Dr. Ahlam. And we have Annalise.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for an interesting talk. I especially like the idea of translating literature into another media. The idea of translating literature is creating a totally new work, but it's always misconceived when a work of art is adapted into a movie. People start comparing the movie to the novel or to the work of art, as if the producer had to follow the author of the work of art verbatim. Would you speak more about this, about the idea of adapting a work of art, and that it's totally a new work. It has its own rules and its own way of analysis, and it shouldn't at all be compared or be expected to follow the rules of the work of art.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is a great question. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a bit more about that. So if we look in parallel at what happens in translation studies with what happens in adaptation studies, you will see that this is already a question that is very much on the table and has been so for at least, I would say, the past 20 years. On the one hand, in translation studies, spearheaded especially by like Larry Venuti, Susan Bosnett, there is a lot of talk of translation is a form of creation. We no longer believe in fidelity to the original. Everything is radically transformed because, like Walter Benjamin says in The Task of the Translator, which really comes back in full force with this new venue of translation studies, it is truly the afterlife of a work. Therefore, the work dies in a certain culture to be reborn in a different one. Therefore, it is, yes, an object that should be not compared to an original that it will never, match, simply because it is something different. And I think I would add here and recommend Larry Venuti's book, Translation Changes Everything, which kind of really tells you exactly what this thing is about. On the other hand, in adaptation studies, you have a very good book by Linda Hutchin, who's actually a theorist of postmodernism, and it's called Theory of Adaptation. And that is where she, lays the basis for judging a film not through fidelity in relation to the book that's supposed to be the origin. And I think both these trends in adaptation studies and also in translation studies, they actually have the root in Andrei Bazin's theories, because Andrei Bazin wrote in 1940 and 1950, and he's 40 years before these things come back. And Bazin is himself, he's a literary historian, he's also an art theorist, he's also a film theorist, and he didn't have the problem of how do I bring these together with the author's intention. So it's very important to no longer judge, as Bazin himself says, to no longer judge the relation between the contemporary work and the past work that is rewriting, retranslating into another medium, using a sort of hierarchy. Oh, there is this great original and I will never live up to it. And I think this rethinking that we're seeing today of translation truly as a work of creation in itself is also something that we can verify by looking at the way prizes are being given. For instance, the Man Booker Prize for international books is always split now between the writer and the translator. And also more recently, actually, I have in my Facebook list, Jennifer Croft, she's the translator of Olga Tokarczuk, and she actually made a posting a few days ago saying, I no longer work with publishers who will not print my name on the book as the translator, because this is truly a work of a creation in itself and should be treated accordingly. So we are really worlds apart from the early days of translation, when you would not even find the translator's name, or you would get someone like Antoine Galland putting in his own Aladdin's tale into the 1001 Nights,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Delia.
Absolutely. The idea of the original was deconstructed a long time ago. We can no longer talk about something called original. There is nothing of the sort. There is no original. It's always a rewriting and
absolutely, yes. I think the post-structuralists did that very well. The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, of course, that's where he really deconstructs this whole idea of originality, which is, of course, a romantic a romantic idea.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you so much.
We have another question. Annalisa, if you'd like to say your question.
Hello, just a second. Yes, I don't know if my camera works.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Look, David, look, it's Annalisa. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Professor
Oh,
Damrus.
now I feel bad because you're such a brilliant film specialist and make me feel like
I would like, first of all, to say my deepest congratulations to you, Delia, for your wonderful conference. And it's really amazing to see how the circulation of ideas from comparative literature to comparative cinema, world literature, world cinema is moving on our discipline, our studies. And of course, I've learned a lot, and you are the author of a wonderful book as well, where many examples that you mentioned today are analyzed in depth, in profundity. And so I would like to ask a question, a sort of resume question, because I think our main concern is in a way the same that Bazin, that the same of Bazin, the idea that literature learns from cinema and cinema learns from literature, said in a very simple way. Considering the actual studies and research on world literature and world cinema, what would, in your opinion, is the concept that literature or literary studies can learn from world cinema studies? I mean, if we think about Roland Barthes, the idea of écriture migrated from literature to cinema in a very powerful way. But in all the extraordinary research that you have mentioned today, which is the concept that has arisen in world cinema studies that, in your opinion, can help to rethink something in comparative literature? I mean, if we just do the other way around, does écriture migrated from literature to cinema in a very fruitful way, which is the concept that today we can take from world cinema to rethink some aspects of literature, which is will be in a way our position. We live between literature and cinema. So in this, I think this can be an interesting point for a new research. Thank you so much for your wonderful conference, Delia. Thank you. It was a pleasure to listen to you.
No, thank you for taking the time, because we all know, time is the greatest gift anyone can make us, Well, actually, I know I will repeat myself, but I like the impurity that, Bazin puts forth. I really love it, because we're so obsessed in literature to think of what is truly specific, to language and to literature. But I really think it's this impurity or hybridity, whatever it is you want to call it, that I think we should really look back at. And I think that, I don't know, it's perhaps, I know you asked me about world cinema, and I do have my reservations there, because first of all, unlike in world literature as a discipline, in world cinema, we don't really have like a theorist who writes his or her own body of theory. Like there's no what is world literature book, you know what I'm saying? Like there's no one single author who produces a definition, a methodology, and actually practices it like that. You can also see this in the fact that, didn't you notice, Annalisa, that almost everything in world cinema comes out as a published volume, collected, edited? It's almost like, can't people just write their own, view of things? You also have, of course, the authored book, but they kind of just repeat concepts that are very much borrowed from literary theory of the 1970s and 1980s, and also world literature, I think, from the 2000s. They're kind of the same concepts. So that's why I actually go back to Bazin. I really think impurity is the thing. And here, thank you for saying this, because now I get the opportunity to say something that I absolutely find revelatory for this whole notion we have of, oh, the purity of our art. Tarkovsky was so obsessed to define the purity of cinema. He spends sculpting and time doing that. But then when he actually comes to it, he says, so truly, what is specific to cinema and cinema alone is a certain observation of the image that is just the purity of the image. And then in the next sentence, he says, oh, actually, the haiku does the same thing. Therefore, he says, I don't think it's specific only to cinema. I think that is really the takeaway for today. We should think about Tarkovsky's own reflection.
Thank you so much, Delia, because I have, when I was writing down my question, I have marked mixed impureness in a way. I totally agree with you that was the reason of my question, because there is a lot of writing about world cinema, but I have the feeling, and of course I live in Spain, I don't read so much as you do English research, but I have the impression that the genuine idea of Bazin, this idea of mixing things and making things circulated, is still the most powerful idea to think the way in which artists work. Maybe not theoreticians work, but artists really work making circulating things. And Pasolini is a good example of it, because I have just finished a book on Pasolini, I hope. And what I've learned from his work is that he was roughly criticized by academics, among them Umberto Eco, who consider that he uses concepts and theory in a very inappropriate way. But actually, his lesson has been more lively and more intense in the future than many of the lessons of the academies. Sorry for my child. I'm sorry, that have already been forgotten. So in this way, this was my concern. Is there another concept so powerful as mixed cinema? And as far as I understand, no. Thank you.
No, the answer is no. It's a very simple answer. And I will also say, well, it is the difference between the visionary and the rest of the world. That's Bazin to you, yeah, he is a visionary. I mean, everything he produced in articles, because he never actually got around to put them into a book. He died so early in mid-1950s. It's very young, it's absolutely brilliant and so smart. It's almost like, of course, forgive the comparison, but it's almost just like, with Shakespeare, he could never really be bothered to, collect all his work. Thank God for Ben Jonson, right? And it's actually because they have this, like Harold Bloom says it, Shakespeare has the, carelessness of nature. I think it's Bazin's the same, because we all know, and that's a reality that people don't really want to acknowledge, but it's also true. There is a terrible narcissism in scholarship. Bazin did not have it. Mm-hmm. And that is when you actually produce something genuinely your own, something that is actually bigger than yourself. To go back to Herta Müller, in the same interview, she actually says, I never choose my theme chooses me. It's because it's something bigger than myself. It's also something that, comes back with Proust, with Woolf, it's all through à la recherche, this problem that you actually are moved by something that is beyond you and your own, narcissistic small circle, where you try to, how shall I say this? You try to be Adam and name the world all over again. Didn't you notice how many concepts, every single article proposes a new concept? How about we just use the very good ones we have, instead of all of us trying to reinvent the world, from scratch? It's much better to use the good things that already exist out there. It's almost like, why do we need a button that does something that, I already have a button for? You don't need that.
Thank you so much, Delia. Thank you.
No, thank you for allowing me to say how much I love Bazin. Such a brilliant theorist.
It shows.
Totally agree.
So do we have other questions? So I'd like to thank you, Delia. We agreed on a 45-minute talk and it's almost 2 hours now. So thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. Actually, I'm sure I've had lots of notes. I know other people have as well. So thank you so much for an enlightening and informing talk that made lots of us actually, our minds are buzzed with questions for coming research that we could do. Thank you so much, Professor Damroch, for being here, and for my colleagues at work and for my professors when I was a student. So thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Hoda, for hosting me and for allowing me to remember why IWL is such a lovely place to be. Because Annalisa is IWL, you are IWL. There are so many other people who are, and I hope that our family will continue to increase. So, word to the wise: do apply to the Institute for World Literature already next year, because this year we are full. So the application begins on November 1st, and it's going to be at Harvard next year. So we all wait to get your applications.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Delia. It was a pleasure to see you.
Pleasure to see you all.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye. Bye.